Hello, friends, and welcome back to our virtual Roundtable series here by GlocalNet. Thank you so much for watching and using this webinar as a resource, as we've had handfuls of these resources. And if you haven't watched them, like Derwin Gray and Ambassador Doug Holliday and Pastor John Jenkins and Shane Pruitt, just a slew of great resources for you pastors to be able to do that. But today's special, because not only is it for pastors, but it's really for everyday Christians. How to live out your faith in the public square, living out your faith in your workplace or wherever you go. And really, it's domain engagement. And that's a big pillar in GlocalNet family of churches. Domain engagement is so important because it's really how to go about life and mobilizing our everyday Christians and everyone into society and living there out and showing your faith in the public square. And domains are the place where your work and God's purpose intersect for the kingdom to come to earth. Jason Romano comes to us from ESPN, where he spent 17 years there as a producer for Mike and Mike in the Morning, Monday Night Football, Outside the Lines, College Game Day. If you're a sports fan and you've watched ESPN, he's probably produced it. So we're excited to have him here to really talk about domain engagement, how to live out your faith in the workplace. So whether you're a pastor or an everyday Christian, this hopefully will be a blessing to you today. Another thing I want to talk about right before we hop in to this interview is we are so excited for a brand new resource. Pastor Bob Roberts Jr. is launching a brand new podcast called Bold Love. It's really to tell the stories, the uncommon path of bridge builders and peacemakers. Bob has had the ability to go around the world and really have bold love by loving our neighbor, loving our enemies. So he has some never before told stories with some of his friends that he's met across the world. And he's telling those stories on the Bold Love podcast. If you have an Apple phone, you can go to Apple Podcast or Spotify, or it's on all different type of podcast platforms. So please go in there, subscribe, take a listen to a trailer that's on there right now, and hear of these journeys of bold love. Here we go. I'm going to go ahead and throw it. Pastor Bob Roberts Jr. and Jason Romano.
Hi, I'm Bob Roberts with GlocalNet, and we are excited to have you for another episode of Virtual Roundtable. And today we're talking about Christian leadership and faith in the public workspace. You know, one of the things that GlocalNet tries to emphasize is, what does it mean to follow Jesus in the public square? And so we're big about teaching pastors, how do you talk about God in a very positive way, in a pleasant way, in the public square, not compromising your faith, but at the same time being kind and gracious and how you communicate. Well, I think business leaders, I think people like sports figures who follow Jesus, doctors, government leaders. I mean, you can look at all the sectors of society. They have to do this every day. And I've learned more about working in the public square, frankly, working with diplomats than any other group, just watching them. How do they stand up for America or their country without being belittling to others? How do they talk about their faith? And so today I'm excited to have one of those leaders with us, Jason Romano. For 17 years, he was at ESPN. He was with the who's who in the sports world. He's a big deal, interviewer and everything else. And I get to interview him. Jason, I'm not going to be near the interviewer you are, so I know you won't expect that. But I want to thank you for taking the time to come on and to encourage people that follow Jesus in their work. And I'm grateful for you being here. I want to know about your journey and your story. Yeah. I'm curious about this. I'm excited when I find out that guy's a follower of Jesus. Tell us your story.
Yeah, for many years as a kid growing up, I grew up in upstate New York, in the Albany, New York area, the capital of New York State. From a very early age, sports was a dominating part of my life. That was all I cared about. I played it, I watched it, I studied it. You know, I can remember at a very young age, 12, 13 years old, knowing all of the Super Bowl winners and who played in the game and what the score was. I mean, I was a sports nut. And throughout high school, that was the way it was for me. And even into college, when I realized I wasn't going to be a pro athlete, I figured I can go into college and study broadcasting and then be able to work in broadcasting sports. So sports has always been a big part of my life. I tell people when I was younger, sports was my God. I didn't really have a faith component growing up. I did go to church occasionally with my grandfather over at St. Patrick's Church in Ravenna, New York, where I grew up. And I did my first communion and my confirmation and the things that good Catholic kids did. But I really did that out of obligation from my parents and from my grandfather, and didn't really understand who Jesus was, didn't have a relationship. I had never heard that word relationship with the Lord, salvation, some of these buzzwords that you'd hear about. I never knew anything about that. In fact, I knew very little about who Jesus was or what the Bible had to say about anything. And quite frankly, I didn't care. I was so focused on my life and my sports journey that was really what took precedent. And it wasn't until I was 27 years old, and it was Mother's Day of 2001, that I was sitting in the back bedroom of my brother's house, and I had just come from his church that morning experience, and it was not the Catholic church that I grew up in. This was a Pentecostal, charismatic church preaching the gospel of Jesus, and there was clapping and singing and worship, and it was on the complete other end of the spectrum from what I grew up in. But that day, I was at least curious. My heart was opened. I tell people, who don't have a relationship with the Lord or don't think they know enough about the Bible, I'm like, listen, you don't have to know anything to say yes and start that journey. And for me that day, that was me saying yes. My brother saw an opportunity, and he just asked me, he said, Jason, would you like to learn more about what we were preaching about at that church service this morning? Can I tell you a little bit more about my faith? Because my brother had gotten saved, I want to say it was 3 years earlier, 2.5 years earlier. We watched this sort of new transformation take place in his life. But, we all thought he was crazy. And we said, that's good for him. He's not doing the bad things anymore. But that's not for us. But I finally just said, yeah, tell me more about this. And it was that day where he shared the gospel with me. And again, I didn't understand it completely, but I said yes. And now it's 19 plus years later. And I've still been on this journey with the Lord. So I have my brother to thank. He's a pastor now and a Bible president, professor guy, and he just knows more about the Bible than any person I know. But initially, back in 2001, on Mother's Day, he was the one that started the journey and had enough boldness really to recognize the opportunity and share his faith with me.
So what was it like knowing Jesus, following him? Then you go to work with ESPN. Was it hard living your faith out in that context?
Yes. In fact, I started at ESPN in 2000. So I had been there a year earlier. In July 18th of 2000 was my first day at ESPN, and I get saved on Mother's Day 2001. So I'd seen for about 8-9 months that world of ESPN, and I loved my job. I mean, if you asked me the most important things in my life in 2000 or 2001 before I got saved, I would have told you my wife and then ESPN. I probably would have put that over a lot of other things that I shouldn't have. And if you really knew me, even after I said yes to the Lord, the dominating God factor in my life, the thing that I centered most on was probably my job. And I'm ashamed to say that because I was married and eventually became a dad. And, my job required a lot of time and effort and attention. And quite frankly, that's where I really dedicated it to. But it's funny, early on becoming a Christian, it wasn't like a fire and brimstone. I wasn't on fire for the Lord type of thing. It really was a gradual process for me. It took me about a year to really fully understand the decision that I had made and who Jesus was. But for about 7 years there, to be honest, Bob, I thought I go to church on Sundays. Maybe I'm in a life group or a home group or a Bible study, which I was and still am. And then maybe read my Bible a little bit and pray. And that was sort of this. And then there was ESPN, and then there was my wife and my daughter, but then there's ESPN. And I had for many years sort of kept that separate. Now, I wouldn't hide my faith. I wasn't ashamed of my faith, but I wasn't recognizing that I could be a Christian in the workplace. I tell people I was an ESPN producer who happened to be a Christian. And it took me about 8 or 9 years to understand, to flip those, that I was a Christian.
How did you flip that?
Yeah, so it was a moment in 2010. Coach Tony Dungy, you might know that
Oh
name.
yeah,
Coach
sure.
Tony Dungy comes to ESPN, and my job at that time, I was a talent producer, was to sort of schedule the days of athletes and coaches to come to ESPN to do interviews. We called it the ESPN car wash. And I was the producer who would sort of set the schedule and then sort of be their chauffeur and take them around from show to show and make sure that the day went off properly. And so Coach Dungy comes to ESPN this day, and I'm really excited because my journey with the Lord had grown by that time, and I still was confused a little bit about how to be a Christian in the workplace, but I certainly knew that I was a Christian, and I knew Coach Dungy loved the Lord. And he's the first African American coach to ever win a Super Bowl. He's the guy that is open about his faith in Jesus as well as anybody I know, and certainly in the football space. And so I knew that I wanted to talk to him about Jesus a little bit. And the people that he had with him, there were three people: his co-author Nathan, his publicist, and his assistant Jessica. And so those three people were with them, and I had worked with those three people on prior projects, so they knew my faith. They knew I was a Christian as well. So Coach Dungy comes to ESPN that day, and he sits down and he finishes a show. Mike and Mike in the Morning was the first show he did. He finishes that show, and we're in our green room, just kind of hanging out, quiet room. And that's the moment where he took an interest in me, because I had a ton of questions to ask him, just like you would
Oh,
or
that's
anybody would.
cool. Yeah.
But he stopped and he said, "Jason, tell me about you. Tell me who you are." And so I shared a little bit about who I was, my job. And then he says, "So you're a Christian. Let me ask you this question." And this is the question, Bob, that changed my life forever. He says, "How do you, Jason, as a Christian, live your faith out here in the workplace at ESPN?" Similar question to what you asked. And I was shocked. And I really had never been asked that question before. And I didn't know how to respond. In fact, my answer to him was, I called him Coach. I said, "Coach, I don't even know what that means or if I can even do that." I said, "If I'm going to live my faith out in my job, I got to go work for a church or a ministry or Fellowship of Christian Athletes, something that has sports and faith intertwined. I don't know how to be a Christian in the workplace. I really can't do that here. I think I'd have to leave if I wanted to do that." And I could sense Coach Dungy just a little uneasy, and he's about to jump in. And before he jumps in, his assistant Jessica comes right in front of him and looks at me, puts her hands on her hips like a stern mom, just upset with their kid over what they just did. Maybe they spilled milk on the carpet or something, or soda on the carpet. And she looks at me and she says, "Jason, you don't get it, do you?" And I said, "Jessica, what don't I get?" And she goes, "Look, what Coach Dundee is referring to here is the place that you work. Look at the mission field that you have here. There's 4,000 employees at ESPN on the campus of Bristol, Connecticut. And you come to work every day and look at the impact that you can make on these people's lives."
I love that.
And she said, your mission is right here, right now. And maybe someday God will call you away to go into sports ministry, which, spoiler alert, he has. But she says, until that day comes, you are to bloom where you're planted right here at ESPN. And I was so taken back by that, but it was like a light bulb was shining bright above my head and just said, "Oh my gosh, I get it now." Like my eyes were open, the scales were pulled away from my eyes. And I said, "I get it now."
I
And
want to
that,
ask you a
yeah,
question though.
yeah,
Here's what really frustrates me. I think I'm a pastor, and I think a lot of pastors are listening to this, and it's depressing. It's exciting when we hear you talk, but what can we do to call out people in our church to do exactly what you did? Where are we failing at the point of helping people understand, hey, right where you live is the mission field of the church, because you are the church. Now, our job is to equip you in that mission field. That's not in the set of questions we were going to ask, but this is just too good. What would you say? Hey, Bob, here's what
yeah.
I would say to pastors who really want to see their members being missionaries in the city.
Well, I think the first thing is to start with that order that I was talking about, to let people know, hey, you're a follower of Christ first. Like that isn't just a piece of your life. That is the centerpiece of who you are. So if you go to the grocery store or the gas station or to your workplace or wherever you go, like you are a follower of Christ first and you're everything else second. I would argue even in your marriage and in
I
your
would too.
relationship with your children, you're a follower of Christ first. and then you're a husband and a dad and, a producer at ESPN or whatever. So I think the church, for me, I think back to my pastor. I'm an elder at my church now, so I'm on the board with those same people, some of them who were pastoring me during those times. And I think the one thing I would say was just making sure that we're not just preaching the gospel, but we're equipping. It's disciple making is really what it is. And it's equipping people to understand that when you go out of these four walls on Sunday, this isn't where it ends. It's actually, this is where it begins. And now the ministry is wherever you go, and remembering that. And obviously, I couldn't walk around ESPN with a cross on my shirt and a Bible in my hand and telling every person who's walking around that they had to repent because the kingdom of heaven was coming. If I did that, I would have gotten fired. But I try to talk about living out your faith in the workplace at my church as much as possible, because what I could do was do the one thing everybody can do, and that is build relationships with people. That's disciple making. And through these relationships, now you're really getting to know people and going beneath the surface of just talking about work, and you can get deeper. And through those relationships, I know that happened for me, it allowed me to have conversations with different people at work about my faith, because they would ask me, once they got to know me, what's the most important thing in your life? Tell me about you. And I would talk about my wife and my daughter and my family, and I'd talk about my faith. And so there's really easy opportunities to live as Christ would live. Now, listen, the way to truly be a witness for Christ is to do what Jesus said in Matthew 20:28. He said he came not to be served, but to serve. And so if you're living out your faith in the workplace, you're serving the people around you who you work with. And, I got that. It took me a while to get that, but I got that probably the last 4 or 5 years of my time at ESPN.
One of the things, I think a Joseph moment for the pandemic for the church, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. And I think one of the things the church is being reduced to is simplicity right now, about living your faith where you are. That's it. Because the big Sunday stuff is pretty challenging right now. Here's what's crazy. Everything you're talking about is in this book. I love this book. You can see
Awesome.
I've outlined, I've underlined it, and I've taken some notes. It's called The Uniform of Leadership. And it's literally what we're talking about. The stories that you're hearing, it's all in here. Could I ask you some questions about this book?
Let's do it. Absolutely.
I loved it. It was cool. And you said something. I thought about this as a leadership book and how to live your faith, but I never thought of it as a discipleship book. But it is. Because what you're saying is, this is what it looks like for those of us who are not in, quote, religious work like you, Bob, and pastors listening. Here's something you said. It just backs up everything you said. The best leaders are those who live in the present, love and serve those around them right where they are. What does that look like?
Yeah, that's a hard one for me. It was a really hard one for me because I was so destination focused that I lost the journey. I lost the day-to-day being present with the people I worked with. I was focused on, even after becoming a Christian, climbing the corporate ladder, accomplishment, achievement, identity. That's a buzzword right now in the Christian space, especially for athletes. And my identity was easily rooted on who I was as a producer at ESPN, not who I was as a follower of Christ. And I was not present in those moments. And so I'd like to say I was wearing the uniform of leadership backwards quite often during my time at ESPN. I was focused on Jason more than I was focused on God or others. But being present in the moment it goes back to Coach Dungy, that moment of understanding that I could be a follower of Christ in the workplace first, not a producer at ESPN first. It allowed me to live like Jesus, to serve. But when you look in the Gospels, right, when you look at Jesus and when he came in contact with different people, he was as present with those people as he could be. And he also took time to get away and go be with the Father and have that time of prayer. But when he was with you talking, you can think about the numerous examples, the woman at the well, the rich young ruler, all of these moments, he is present in that moment. Now, I have no idea how long those moments were, but he knew about the journey or the destination, but he also recognized the journey and in those moments. And I think as leaders, as disciples of Christ, as we model the life of Jesus, being present is so vital. We all have the destination in mind, in terms of work, or trying to get that raise, or trying to get that new job, or maybe thinking the grass is greener over there, so I'm going to go work over there. And we forget that in the moment we're in right now, it goes back to those words, bloom where you're planted. That's being present in the moment, right where you're at.
Let me ask you this. You use the metaphor in the book of the kingdom uniform. Every chapter is built on that.
Yeah.
Talk to me a little bit about that. Explain that metaphor.
Yeah. So the whole idea of the uniform of leadership is a metaphor, right? And every single day we wake up, we have a choice because we're going to put this uniform on, whether we like it or not. Because everyone is called, in my opinion, to be a leader. If you have influence on others and you can serve, which we all pretty much can, you're a leader. Leadership is not title or status. Many of us in the world identify people as leaders because of title and status or job, wherever you are in the hierarchy, even pastors are automatically deemed as leaders. But there's many people in that church service that's a leader sitting right there that can be a leader right where they are. And so every single day we put that uniform on, that metaphorical uniform of leadership. The question is, this is the kingdom uniform here. How are we wearing our uniform every day? Like I said, for me, I would wake up, the very first thing I do is think about Jason. I might not have my priorities in order, which is God first, others second, and then myself third. I'm not taking myself completely out of the equation. I'm just making sure the order is proper here. When you wear a uniform of leadership backwards, think of the uniform that you'd wear for a sports team. It has the team on the front, the name, and then it has the name of the person who the athlete is on the back. And for a lot of us, we wear that uniform backwards. We put our name on the front, and we put others and God in the back. And that kingdom uniform is understanding that order. Man, seek the Lord first. Matthew 6:33, right? Seek the kingdom of God first, and everything else will be added unto you. Like
That's
Jesus
my
said
favorite
it.
verse in the whole Bible.
He says it.
When you say kingdom, what do you mean by that?
The kingdom to me is the kingdom of God. It's the body of believers. It's Jesus. It's, all of us as a collective body. Now, the book is not written just for believers, but when we're talking about a kingdom uniform, we're talking about seeking God first. We're talking about the kingdom of God here on earth. That's who we are as followers of Christ. When we say yes to Jesus, we become a follower of Christ. We become a Christian. We are called to be the hands and feet of Jesus here on this earth. And so that's really what I mean by kingdom. Now, we could also talk about the kingdom of God as in the destination where we're all hopefully going to go, who've accepted Christ as Savior when we pass from this earth. But I think the kingdom mindset on this earth, the one that we're in right now as we talk, Bob, is seeking him first. That's the uniform. It's not complicated. We make it complicated because we're so self-centered and self-focused so often, but it's really not that complicated. The blueprint's right there. And I just took the words and changed them around and made it a kingdom uniform for a book, but it's really seeking Christ first in all that we do.
That's good. I love that verse. It's a Jewish pastor wrote that in my Bible when I was 6 years old. Let me ask you this. You talked a little bit about identity. In your book, you talk about this jersey effect, which is identity built on importance or value. And I frankly think that's a big deal for pastors and obviously everybody else, but pastors would say, oh no, but it is. Talk about that.
Importance versus value. I think the key here is remembering who you are in Christ, right? And the value of yourself from God and the value of others, not the importance of who you are, and seeking importance. That's the seeking of approval from man. That's the seeking of accomplishment. I'm talking about the value of others. See, our value, so many of us think our value is found in what we've done. You're a pastor, your value is, because you're a pastor, your value is found in that. Because I host a podcast or written a couple books or worked at ESPN, my value is found in that. And my goal as a leader, in my experiences as a leader and the best leaders that I've been around, see the value in people not because of what they've done or what they're doing. They see the value because they're alive and breathing and they're human. And so God sees that person and says, they're valuable to me. And so that's the kingdom mindset, and looking at people from a value perspective, not an importance. If I look at a person from an importance perspective, it's what can they do for me, right? Why are they important? Because they can accomplish this task that I'm giving them. But my value looks at them and says, even if they don't accomplish this task, or we need to work on something or whatever, their value is not found in that. And again, it's an easy concept, Bob. It's not an easy thing to implement because we're worldly focused in so many ways, and it's a mindset that we have to kind of come back to, and remembering that we are not of this world. We are in the world, but we are not of this world. There's a kingdom mindset that we have to be thinking about.
When you think about value, I'm curious. I think when we find our identity, yes, we're sons and daughters of God. I get that. But I think there's also a lot of deconstruction about who we thought we were, from childhood experiences, from discovering that success is not enough. David Brooks, I don't know if you're familiar with him, but just wrote a book called The Second Mountain. It's incredible. And he makes a similar statement, but he also talks about how we have to go through this crushing experience after success. So he says, we got to win all the awards. We've got to get to the top of the heap. But it's only after that most of us can find our value, because we're so busy trying to find significance. Did you go through that in your life? Did you have any junk in your past you had to deal with? Did you have some crashes after you became a Christian?
Sure.
Where, it's wait. I got to get this right.
Yeah. I mean, if I say no, I didn't have any junk in my life, I would just stand up here and be lying to you. And if anybody else says,
tell us about your biggest sin.
Oh gosh,
no, I'm teasing.
I was like, Bob, what are you doing to me, man?
Tell us about a crash that you feel secure in telling us about.
Of course. No, my point was that we all have junk, and if we say we don't, we're lying. But for me, here's an example. In 2008, I talked about wearing that uniform of leadership properly. This was a point in my journey at ESPN when I had been there for 8 years. I've been a Christian for 6.5, 7 of those years, and still hadn't quite figured out the whole living out your faith in the workplace. So I was so focused on climbing that corporate ladder, and I was, approached about a year earlier to get ready to get training, because I was going to become what's called a line producer at ESPN. So that means you're in charge of a show, and you sit in the control room, and you call the shots, and you're the guy that's really directing and leading the show each day. And this was a show called Outside the Lines at ESPN, hosted by a guy named Bob Lee, who had been there forever. There's a whole chapter on Bob in the book. It's called The General's Culture. He had a very powerful impact on my life. But this show had recognized my talent and said, Jason, we want to groom you to become a producer. I was so excited, but I was so focused on becoming a producer that for the next year, as I was training to become a producer, and I was given these shows, there were days where I was, even though I didn't have the title, I was leading and producing Outside the Lines. And I had a team of 7 or 8, and I was producing Bob Lee, the legend at ESPN. And I got so caught up in training and getting ready to go to become a producer that I forgot about the job I'm actually being paid to do, which was talent producer. And that's booking guests and kind of lining up all the different interviews that you'd see, kind of what I was explaining earlier. And so here comes May of 2008. And at ESPN, you have 2 times that you get sort of reviews officially from ESPN from your boss. In May of 2008, I got my mid-year review. And then usually it's October, I think, that we get our year-end review. So I get this mid-year review in May of 2008, and it's scathing. Bob, it is one of those where you just don't want to look at a review. It's the worst review I ever got. And it wasn't that I wasn't doing a good job in the sense of trying to train to become a producer. It literally said in the review, I have it somewhere in my room here. It says, Jason is so focused on trying to become a producer that he's forgetting about doing a great job with the job that he has currently. Mm-hmm. And that not only affects Jason, that affects the team around him. And thus we got problems. And when I read it, I almost started crying, as weird as this sounds, because I was first time I'd ever had like a negative, bad review. But it was humbling. But you know what? The person who sent that review to me, my boss, she was right. She was spot on. I was so focused. And so this isn't a crash, but this was This was a little, a nudge, let's just say, not only from God, but from my people around me that were like, wait a minute, we need you here. Like, we're a team of 5 people as talent producers. And if you're faltering or focused on something else, the other 4 people here are going to be affected. And from that moment on, I would say, again, Tony Dungy, all of these things kind of worked together for a couple years there. I realized that I had to, again, bloom where you're planted. I had to be focused on the present, and I never got that job, by the way, as a producer that I was being trained for. And I said, you know what, I'm just going to focus on being the best talent producer that I could be. And I spent the next couple years doing that. And then obviously, opportunities started to come, and I shouldn't say obviously, but opportunities started to come and doors started to open when I started wearing that uniform properly and understanding to serve the people that I was working with and just be great where I was, as opposed to trying to be great where I was going. And that's about as humbling experience, Bob, that you can get when you get those mid-year reviews. And,
Good.
there's
Good.
never a promise that you're going to have that job the next day. And I thought, I'm in trouble here. So all I could control was being a great teammate and doing the best job of those job that I was being paid to do.
You also write about when you're setting the climate in leadership and so forth, about this concept. I've never heard it put this way, but you called it active patience.
Yeah.
I didn't like that. It's true. I struggle with that. Do you
Well, we all
with
struggle
that
with
just a
patience,
theory,
right?
or have you mastered that? Help.
Well, I haven't mastered it, but I went through it, and here's what happened. So, and it's funny, I didn't really know what active patience was until about 3 or 4 years ago. In 2015, I was probably having my toughest time as an employee at ESPN. Boss and I weren't seeing eye to eye. I didn't feel like I was being appreciated. I was trying to wear the uniform properly at work as a leader, but I just didn't feel like something was right. I felt off, and I would come home every day. It was the first time, and probably the only time in 17 years, that I was actually complaining a little bit to my wife about my job. And listen, I had the best job. I mean, I get to go to work and talk about sports and play in the sports department. We got to play in the toy department every day, as we like to say at ESPN. So I'm not complaining in that world, but we all had those tough seasons. And in 2015, I was ready to jump ship. In fact, an opportunity came to go work in sports ministry in 2015. And I said, I'm out. Like, if this is a real job offer, I'm ready to go. And I remember going to my wife and saying, let's go. I'm out of here. And she stopped me and she's like, Jason, first of all, we're in Bristol, Connecticut because of your job. Like, we're not leaving, or you're not going anywhere just off the cuff. Let's talk about this. But then she saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. She saw me wanting to bolt and leave when things were bad. And that's an easy time for all of us to leave when things are bad. She's like, you're acting on your feelings here. I don't think this is God calling us away right now. This isn't the time. And so when the wife speaks, we got to listen. And I said, okay. And we tabled that. Well, don't you know, a week or two later, I get a call to go work on a show called Mike and Mike in the Morning. And I had worked on Mike and Mike, very popular morning show at ESPN, when I first got there 20 years ago. And then fast forward 16 years later, I'm back on the show working on Mike and Mike. And I was just looking for a change. Okay, this might be the different environment that I'm looking to get, at ESPN. Maybe this will be better for me, blah, blah, blah. So I take the job and I love it. It's the most fun I've had in the 17 years I was there. Was working my last year on Mike and Mike. But I also still knew God was calling me away. And I didn't know what that meant. I just really felt a stirring in my spirit that the time was probably coming up. So I spent 2016, here's where the active patience comes in, Bob. I spent 2016 knowing that my time was up in the midst of enjoying the job more than I'd ever enjoyed at ESPN. And so what did I do? I didn't just sit around on my chair and say, okay, God, I'm going to be patient here. Tell me what you want me to do. Instead, I said, God, I'm going to be patient here, but I'm going to be intentional in this next 6 months or so about building relationships with people outside of ESPN. And so through Twitter and Instagram and, just relationships with people I knew, I was setting up a call every other day or every week, Bob, to have with someone outside of ESPN, and in many cases outside of sports. A lot of them were pastors, they were authors, they were leaders in different spaces. And all I wanted to do was just learn about their journey. This was not me trying to get a job. It wasn't me asking them if they had any openings. All I wanted to do is really learn from them and hear their story. And I got to tell you, a couple things happened during that time. To me, that's the act of patience, Bob. That's not sitting on my butt waiting. That's actually building relationships. Through that, two opportunities came. The first was to write my first book, Live to Forgive. It came from a guy named Stephen Copeland, who is my co-author for both my books. And Steve and I had a call on one of those calls that I had set up. And we just started talking, and the idea of writing a book came about, and we proceeded to explore that. And now I got a book, two books with Steve. That all came from being actively patient. The second thing was one of the people that I wanted to learn from and grow from and just kind of hear their story is now my boss with Sports Spectrum, the ministry I work with. He was just a guy who I followed on Twitter. He followed me, and I said, do you have like a half hour? Can I just learn about what your job is and your role and tell you a little bit about what I'm doing at ESPN? And again, not looking for a job. All of a sudden, October of 2016 comes, and I get this call. Hey, we just purchased Sports Spectrum, and we're looking for someone to revitalize this ministry and potentially start a podcast and, run our media side of things here. Would that be something you're interested in? One thing leads to another. I say goodbye in February of 2017 and go to work for Sports Spectrum. So that's the active patience. Isn't just sitting there waiting. And a lot of us do that. We're just sitting there sulking. Like, no, actually get off your butt and begin to cultivate an environment that allows you to talk to other people. And through those, maybe God will open up the door. He will, if you're meant to walk through it. And the worst thing that could happen is you're going to build relationships with people and have another relationship. And that to me was what active patience was.
A lot of people laugh that I grew up with the idea that I could stay at one church for so many years. But I tell them it's been 7 different churches. And there's been a lot of times when I thought, I'm out of here. And I guarantee you, our members have felt that probably more than 7 times. Sure. But the reality is, through sitting still, if you can wait, a lot of times that's just God preparing us for something else. And we got to go through stuff. You made this statement also on page 87. You said, gratitude roots you in the present. And, the whole concept of gratitude, we think about gratitude in terms of boy, this was a big thing that happened. Thank you. But you write it from a little different perspective of, you've just talked about patience and so forth. When you say gratitude, what does that mean? And how do you live that out?
Well, I think we all can find something to be grateful for every day. First of all, if you're a Christian, there's your gratitude right there. Like you're waking up that next day and you're able to say, God, thank you for who you are. Thank you for your son dying on the cross. Like that's where, honestly, I think the attitude of gratitude has to start as a follower of Christ, is just being grateful. So my circumstances might not be great today, or the job I have, or the boss I have might be driving me nuts, but God, you're in charge, and your son died on the cross for me. So there's gratitude right there, right? So it's finding the little things to be grateful for every day. This pandemic has exposed a lot of our idols in life that we've been kind of hanging on to. Specifically for me, sports. You go 5 months or 4 months without sports. That's hard for me, but I could find the good within within the bad. And so, and I'll be honest with you, in 2015, when I was going through that rough patch with my boss, it was hard for me to be grateful every day. And I remember my boss and I just not having a good moment or whatever. And I was having lunch with another friend of mine who had been a previous colleague of mine in my job at ESPN. And she was also a Christian. And she said, Jason, have you thought about praying for your boss? And I said, no. Why would I pray for him? He's driving me nuts right now. And then I knew when I said that, and she started laughing like you did. I'm like, all right, I know you're supposed to, as a follower of Christ, we're supposed to love our enemies, pray for those that persecute us. And I wouldn't call my boss my enemy by any stretch, but I wasn't happy with him. So why would I pray for him? And she just made it, when she said that too, I think gratitude actually starts with prayer. And having an attitude of gratitude is literally, yes, it's thanking Jesus for who he is, but it's also taking yourself out of the equation. Like, again, even in 2015, I was still focused on my circumstances, what I was going through. And so my thought was not to pray for my boss or anybody else that I wasn't getting along with. It was about, oh, woe is me. And so gratitude is not only thanking Jesus for what he's done, but I think it's recognizing that, okay, I need to step back out of my little world for a minute and understand the blessings that are going on around me, and understand that that person, again, it goes back to value too, right, Bob? Like, that person, my boss at that time, God saw that person as valuable for, for his kingdom. And so I should have been praying for him. I should have been interceding for him. And, I think even during this pandemic, that's been another thing too, is to think about, okay, there's a lot of division. There's a lot of things going on in this country that it's just whacked out. It feels like right now. But am I praying for the whacked outedness, if that is even a word?
That's
Am I
good.
praying for those that are in a bad spot? I don't know if I am all the time. And, but if I do, it takes myself out of the equation and lets me be thankful for the opportunity to even be able to pray. So that's gratitude. That's that's a long-winded answer, but
That's
I
all
think
right.
that's where I end.
Well, this book, I want to encourage you to get it. It is incredible. The Uniform of Leadership, it's a discipleship book, and you're going to love it. It's got some profound things in there. I would encourage you to think about it. Here's my last question for you.
Yeah.
When you think about all the people that you've met that are, quote, celebrity type people,
Mm-hmm.
who is the realest one that you met? And
Yeah.
why do you think that is? Nobody's
Well,
perfect. I get that. But
no,
there's
I
a
get
lot
it.
of people I've gotten to know over the years, and I've gone, wow. I was almost sad I got to know that person. They weren't what I thought. And sometimes other people, I got to know them and they were nothing in a positive, they were far better than I had any clue about. Has there
Yeah.
been someone like that? And if so, what was that stood out about them?
Yeah. I can think of, I'll there's a lot of people that I've met who have made an impact. Some of them are in the book, some of them are not. Then there's ones that I thought would be an amazing experience, and they didn't turn out so good. And I left those out of the book because my goal is not to air any dirty laundry
Sure.
when I'm talking about things like that. But I will say, Darryl Strawberry, for me, the baseball player who is now a good friend, uh, shocked me as someone that I was really excited about meeting, spending time with. Much like Coach Dungy, Darryl came to ESPN in 2009, was going to do an interview on all of our different radio shows and TV shows. He was promoting his new book. And I knew, listen, Darryl Strawberry was a childhood hero of mine when I was 12 years old. Like, Darryl Strawberry was the guy. And I knew that I was going to get to spend the day with my childhood hero. So I was really excited to talk to him about, the Mets and those 1980s teams that won World Series and were just amazing, and just tell him how much he meant to me as a baseball player. And don't you know, Bob, we didn't spend any time that day talking about baseball or the Mets. You see, Darryl, if you know anything about Darryl Strawberry, you talk about junk in your life. He reached the top of the ladder and then just crashed and burned.
Yeah.
He lost it all. He got caught up in drugs, alcohol, lots of arrests, unfortunately, some bad things that he had done. And he was in a really, really bad spot. Well, God redeemed him. God brought him out of the pit and has sanctified his life in a way that has allowed him to be a traveling evangelist now. And that's what he does, is he just wants to tell people about Jesus. And now I know Darryl very well. He's a good friend, and I know the real Darryl Strawberry just wants to tell people about Jesus. I love it. But that day, I didn't expect that. But that's exactly what he did. He took an interest in me. He asked me about my life. He asked me about my journey. And then he told me about Jesus and what Jesus had done in his life. And I told him I was a Christian. And, right away, we started talking about matters of faith. We talked about our fathers. Both of us grew up with really difficult childhoods, and our fathers were either verbally or physically abusive. Both our parents our fathers were alcoholics. And so we bonded, weirdly enough, over the brokenness that we both went through as sons of alcoholics and, having that absent father in our life. And don't you know, Daryl Strawberry, after he left that day, asked me for my number. And over the next 4 or 5 years, he would call me maybe a couple times a year. And he would always just say to me, Jason, I'm calling because I want to know how your father's doing. And this was during a time when my father was really struggling with his alcohol and he could not kick the habit and was just in a really bad place. And Daryl Strawberry was calling me, my hero, to ask me about my dad. And so that's about as shocking a day as I'll ever have at ESPN, because my childhood hero became a very good friend of mine just because of where I was that day working
That's
at
cool.
ESPN.
I spoke at an event with him a couple of years ago, and who the heck is Bob Roberts? But we were in this small room, and he comes over and he sits down. He saw me sitting there, and we just started talking. And I thought, that's pretty incredible. I mean,
Right?
He doesn't know me from Adam, and I'm the
Yep.
only white dude at this event with all these about 4,000 African American men.
I love it.
And I
It's
think
awesome.
he's curious, what's this white guy doing here? But we had
Yeah.
a blast. And I mean, we just were laughing our guts out. Then he
Well,
got up there and
he's one of
preached.
those guys too. I got to tell you, Bob, he's so gracious with his time. I've done a couple events with him as well. He wrote the foreword to my first book, and together telling people about his brokenness. I'm talking about forgiveness, about my father's situation, and just doing ministry with him. I've got to watch the real Daryl, because behind the scenes, sometimes it's nice he's talking to me, but how does he treat those that can't do anything for him? Right? That's to me the definition of
I
a
agree.
character, right? How do I treat people who can't do anything for me necessarily?
There it is.
Daryl is the real deal, and he treats everyone, as far as I've seen, like they have value, not because of their work, of what they can do for him, but just because they have value because they're people.
Yeah. Hey, one of my heroes endorsed your book. He's a good friend. I've known him for a few years, Derwin Gray. Derwin just wrote a book. It's a great book.
Yep. Yeah, Derwin's great. He's a very good friend, and he's a guy who's been in ministry and obviously played in the NFL and building up an amazing church down in Charlotte, in the Charlotte area. He's a great guy. He's the real deal.
Yes. Well, God bless you, man. This has been a blast. Hey, thanks for taking the time to do this. And
Absolutely. Thanks, Bob.
May God bless you for doing it.
Thank you, sir.
I mean,
Same to you, and I appreciate you inviting me and having me. This has been great. Thanks so much.